Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be going through an Overlord deck profile, a comprehensive guide for Overlord in this current metagame. We're going to be going through the deck builds, cards to change, budget options, very similar to the Chronojet one and the Minerva one that I did before. So we're going to go through all that, everything that you need to change, as well as the new inclusion of Ardor Hatchet Dragon. So make sure you tune into this one. This is going to be a pretty long one. And yeah, let's get through it. If you guys need any coaching for the BSF and BRO season starting tomorrow, hit me up on Metafy. My link is in the description below. Feel free to book a session and then we can get started. Alright, let's talk about the deck build. This one is a little bit special. We're going to do it on Vanguard Dia Days. This deck is actually available on Dia Days. Well, at least most of it, except for the PR that is coming out during March, which is Ardor Hatchet Dragon. So it's a good platform for me to kind of run through everything. The layout is really nice, so you can see the whole deck without me needing to, fan out some stuff. And here you go. This is pretty much the deck list for the current format at the moment, minus the new promo that is coming out. So just starting with the ride line, we are running the old grade 3 ride line, so having the original Dragonic Overlord, Nahalem, Bahr, and Ardor at the bottom. Very self-explanatory ride line. This ride line actually changes when the new PR comes. So I'll talk about that in a separate section, but this is the current build at the moment, and it's been working well for me. I'll explain through some of the flexible slots as well, the stuff that you can take out for pretty much anything that you want. Then you can kind of slot in between that. For the main deck, we are running 1 of the original Overlord and 4 of the Dragonic Overlord the End. Dragonic Overlord the End is your main ride target after you ride onto the grade 3 Overlord. So post turn 4, this is the card because you're smacking your opponent's Vanguard twice in a turn. It's pretty good. We run the extra Overlord because it's searchable by Burning Horn Dragon. Burning Horn Dragon searches for top 7 for an Overlord. So the more Overlords that you run, the more targets you hit. Hence why we're running the 1 slot here. But to be honest, this slot can be whatever you like. If you feel that you need more of grade 2s, more grade 1s, whatever you feel like, this is a flex slot for you. But I think just putting in the extra Overlord allows me to search and +1, and the +1 might not necessarily be just an attacker that I can put in the front row. I can use it for PGs, I can use it as discard fodder for Dragonic Overlord the End if I don't have Halberd in my hand or something like that. Following on, for the main deck for grade 2, so I run 3 Nahalems, 2 Berserk Dragons, 4 Brachioforce, and 4 Burning Horn Dragon. So first of all, Burning Horn Dragon is your number 1 grade 2. This gains 5k each time you Vanguard attack. So essentially, on your restand turns as of grade 3, you essentially get a free plus 10k, a 20k beta on the board. Actually insane. The best thing about this card is that you can CB1 top 7 for an Overlord search, and if you miss, you can just countercharge 1. Essentially, what it says is that you get a free search, a free shuffle. If you don't hit it, if you get unlucky, then the resource isn't wasted. Otherwise, you're going to CB1 for an Overlord and add it to hand. So good. Why do we run Brachioforce? So Brachioforce is actually a really good early game card, especially in this meta at the moment where you're versing Chronojet. You want an early presence where you apply pressure, you force your opponent to guard, and if your opponent doesn't guard, you punish them by retiring a unit on the field, and then you also trade this card back into your hand by drawing 1. The card itself refunds itself, but not only that, it also retires a unit on your opponent's side of the field, which is super good in this current format because in the early game, you're versing against Jet, they're going to put a Swirler and GG in the front row. Brachioforce, you put it in the front row and you pressure that. It means that your opponent has to guard or they lose either the Swirler or the GG on the board, which means that they can't fight back. Super duper important. I think this card is one of the cards that may or may not stay, but I'll get to that in the next section. I added Berserk Dragon. To be honest, I really didn't feel that this slot was too important. So similar to the Overlord slot, you can actually swap it for more Overlords, or if you have any grade 2s that are beneficial for you, feel free to chuck them in and yeah, just use those slots up for whatever you need. Looking at the grade 1, so we're running 3 PGs and 1 Elementaria, along with 4 Madoka. Madoka is essentially a free 15k shield when your opponent has, I think it's like 8 or more in the drop. Super busted card. 10k booster as well, so if you ever need a boost, you can just drop in, happy days. And 4 of the most strongest card ever released for Dragonic Overlord in the D series, which is Dragritter Halberd. This card is insane. Essentially, it makes a discard 2 a discard 1. You actually cannot play Dragonic Overlord the end without this card. I know that this card is super expensive at the moment, but this PR speaks Overlord and it makes what Overlord is at the moment. So without playing this PR, yeah, you're not playing an Overlord deck. Going back to the deck list itself, going into triggers, so we run 4 heals, 3 of the 10k draws, 1 over trigger, and 8 5k crits. 5k crit is super important. This deck actually doesn't need a lot of soul. Nahalem is like a Soul Blast 1. That's kind of the only thing that you're running it for. Otherwise, nothing else really uses soul because you're always wanting to keep the Overlord in soul so that your Dragonic Overlord the end gains a permanent 5k and he doesn't lose drive checks. That is super important, so make sure you never get rid of your Dragonic Overlord in the soul. Then you don't lose drive checks, you don't lose the 5k. Looking at this build, it is very stock standard. This is pretty much the build that I would bring to a tournament if I were to use Overlord in this current metagame. You want to maybe try to focus more on the early game now because you're playing against Jet. Jet is very early game oriented. So the likes of Brachioforce, that's what you want, right? But unfortunately, you know, Berserk Dragon needs an Overlord Vanguard, so it only turns on grade 3. So if there is an early game card that allows you to retire early, this is the card to change it out for. We've been talking about this new PR that comes out in March. So what is it? It is called Ardor Hatchet Dragon. So the skill is, if your soul has a card with Overlord in its card name, this unit gets 5k shield. So it essentially becomes a 10k shield grade 2. Act skill Rearguard, if your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 or greater, the cost of it is to retire that unit. Choose a grade 3 with Overlord in the drop zone and put it into soul. So why is this important? Essentially, it makes Dragonic Overlord the end going second. When you ride up to grade 3, you're able to fulfill its restand cost and not lose a drive check. Because you're doing that, that means that you are 1 turn faster to getting to Overlord the end because you're running in your ride line, but as well, it means that you're 1 turn quicker to your Persona ride, as well as the pressure starts on grade 3. How is this card important is because not only does it allow you to do that, but it buffs the defense on this deck. To be fair, this deck is already tanky. You're running, 15k Madokas, you're essentially discarding 1 when the cost asks for discard 2 in the Halbay. You're generating a lot of cards, you're restanding a bunch of times. If you hit the OT, which most likely in a game you will, then you're laughing, right? So the fact that you get a 10k shield grade 2 is actually ridiculous. With Ardor Hatchet Dragon, you're able to play the Dragonic Overlord the end in the ride line. So what does that mean to this deck build? How does that change? So essentially what changes is that this Dragonic Overlord in the ride deck becomes Dragonic Overlord the end. Now this is not to say that you cannot play the old Overlord in the ride deck, and I'll tell you guys why in just a sec. So if you're playing Dragonic Overlord the end in the ride deck, that means you have to play 3 more Overlord the ends in the main deck, obviously, because you want the Persona ride, that is important. But as well, you need to run 4 of the original Dragonic Overlord. Why is that? Because you need this card, you need to see this card in the drop zone. If you're going second and you're riding up to Dragonic Overlord the end, you will definitely need a Dragonic Overlord in the drop zone so that Ardor Hatchet Dragon will proc. The question will be now is, what do you swap out for the 2 extra Dragonic Overlords as well as the 4 Ardor Hatchet Dragon? The 3 cards I said were flexible were the 1 Dragonic Overlord and the 2 Berserk, but now that we have to include 4 Dragonic Overlords, obviously these 2 will be then swapped to Dragonic Overlord, the original grade 3. Which leaves a question whether we take out the Brachioforce or some of the Nahalems. Now this is up to you. You have to decide whether you want the early game pressure or you want to essentially utilize Dragon Knight Nahalem to its maximum, essentially, right? You have the choice of removing 4 Brachioforce, or if you find that Nahalem is not worth it to run, which most of the time it really isn't, because It's giving 5k to itself and to the Vanguard, but you're already on an 18k Vanguard, so why does that matter, right? Essentially what should be removed would be 3 Nahalems and 1 Brachioforce. Why is that? When you're substituting 3 Nahalem and 1 Brachioforce for 4 of your Ardor Hatchet Dragon, you're bumping your deck up by 20k worth of shield, but you're also taking away 10k worth of shield because you have to take out the 2 Berserk Dragons, right? Because the Berserk Dragons essentially become Dragonic Overlord grade 3, which is no shield value. So you're actually getting 10k shield more value to your deck. But as well, you need to also think about the current metagame. The current metagame is Chronojet Dragon, Eva, Youthberg. These are decks that have board presence. So if you're pressuring in the early game with Brachioforce, this means that if this unit attack hits, and not only does it have to hit the Vanguard, it can attack and hit the rearguard as well. So you can start punishing just by swinging rearguard. Your opponent retires that one rearguard, which procs this guy's skill and kills another rearguard, right? So it's essentially a 2-for-1 trade, yeah? This card in the early game is too good to take out, because now you're pressuring against a deck that is already pressuring you, because Jet, you drop Swirler and GG, and then the next turn they swap, they drop like 2 10Ks and they smash you in the face. That's pretty much the idea of the current meta at the moment, right? For example, Youthberg, they drop a Calibrate calls something else, or sometimes they drop a Snizel and something else. You have to fight back. Brachioforce allows you to fight back. The need for Nahalem isn't actually that useful, right? In the early game, it's just 10k, like, who cares, right? When you ride on, like, during the ride phase, right? If you're riding up to grade 3, you're going to get that unit anyway. You're going to get Nahalem on the rear guard anyways. Who cares? The most important role that Nahalem plays is that it's a 15k attacker. But what happens if you're going first and your opponent decides to rush you? Then you need a way to essentially come back, right? And how do you do that? The tempo shift in Brachioforce. Brachioforce allows you to fight back on the grade 2 game, the early game pressure that your opponent's putting on you. You know, they're attacking 3 lines, you have to attack them back, right? So Brachioforce allows you to do that. You're taking out Brachioforce, 1 Brachioforce and 3 Nahalem for 4 Ardor Hatchet Dragon, and you're swapping 2 Berserk Dragons for 2 more Dragonic Overlords, and then you're swapping obviously the right deck grade 3 to Dragonic Overlord the end. The question now is, do you run Chalice? And that is maybe. You can run Chalice if you want. Chalice allows you to have a 4th Persona ride, but to be honest, this deck has so much search that you're gonna go find all 3 of your Persona rides anyways. But Burning Horn Dragon is just so good. You're going through your deck like 2 checks, sometimes 2 checks, and then like an OT, which is essentially 7 checks, because the draw on the OT counts as 1, right? So you're going through a bunch of cards. Brachioforce, if it hits, you're sacking it, you're drawing 1. Like, you're going through your deck pretty fast. You hit some draws, you're going through your deck. Like, there's not really much that you really need to find, because you're going to find your Persona rides anyways. Burning Horn allows you to do that. So Chalice, as good as it can be, you can include it. Where I would change it, I'm not too sure. Maybe take out a Madoka for a Chalice. Chalice is pretty good, you know. Persona rides are always good, and especially against a restanding Vanguard, it becomes a 28k. It is pretty legit, right? So maybe you could take out Madoka for 1 Chalice. That's completely fine. There are some other, I guess, changes. Let's just say, you know, you can get your hands on Ardor Hatchet Dragon, and you kind of want to take out, you know, these 3 slots, flexible slots, or maybe you want to take out some Nahalems because you don't find the use for them. What cards can you change into these slots? So the first one is Flarestrike Dragon. Flarestrike Dragon is a promo that got released in last year's Bushiroad Springfest, if I'm not mistaken. So Flarestrike Dragon, the effect is when this unit is placed in rearguard, you can counterblast 1, choose your Vanguard, and give it 10k. As simple as that. Your restanding Vanguard deck, you know, you're gonna restand, you're gonna hit 28, 38 on Persona rides. It's a pretty good time, right? What other changes or what other inclusions can you include in this deck? Let's just say you don't have Flarestrike Dragons. They're pretty hard to come by. You know, They're promos from originals, essentially, right? There's another card called Perforate Burner Dragon. So the skill is that when this is discarded from hand during your battle phase, you can put it into soul and give a unit 5k. The purpose of that card is actually pretty good because you choose any unit. So not only just the Vanguard, you can also choose your rearguards as well. If you want to bump up your Burning Horn Dragon to 25k, 35k, you're able to do that using that grade 2. You can discard, fill up the soul, give 5k to rearguard, or maybe let's just say your Vanguard's a little bit weak, pop it on there on your first re-ride. Happy days, right? You're hitting 23, you're having a good time. With these changes, this would swap out for the likes of Nahalem, the likes of your second Overlord, the likes of Berserk Dragon. The question is now, budget options. Obviously, you know, we all know how expensive this deck is, and it's not because of everything else in this deck other than this boy. Dragritter Halberd is super expensive at the moment. I think it's sitting at like 60 USD, 70 USD a piece, which is actually crazy. If you're playing Overlord, try to steer away from this if you don't have the funds. If your locals is not, you know, giving out the PRs, or you don't have access to the PRs, it's going to be pretty hard for you to get this card. So the question will be, what do you change for this card? And let me tell you, it is very hard. Why is it hard? Because this card is unmatched. Unmatched because Dragonic Overlord, the end, is discarding 2 cards. This card counts as 2 cards. So essentially you save 1 card from being discarded in your hand. Not only that, this card generates itself and calls itself to the back row rearguard and gains 5k. So immediately in the battle phase, it becomes a 13k booster, which means that you can boost on your first Vanguard swing, call this over the booster behind your Vanguard, and swing with another 13k booster again. The question is, what do you change it for? And let me tell you, it's very hard. It is really hard to replace this card. There were likes of Togachirashi, which allows you to fill the soul. Any of the cards I said before, so Flarestrike Dragon, you can, I guess, swap it for Ardor Hatchet Dragon if you have access to that and not Dragritter Halberd, but it's really hard. It is really hard to replace this card, and this card is what makes Dragonic Overlord the end good. So what if you had to replace this card and, you know, you don't have access to it? What cards would you replace in this slot? So I said Togachirashi is one of them. Another one is a cheaper PR, which is called Ifesteio Dragon. So if your unit in the same column as Ifesteio Dragon restands, so usually it'd be placed behind the Vanguard, you can Soul Blast 2, choose one of your opponent's front row rearguards and retire it, and choose one of your Vanguards, gain +5. You have to think about this reversed, right? Instead of gaining advantage into your hand, why don't you do the opposite? The opposite would be reducing the units on your opponent's field or your opponent's hand. When you're reducing units on your opponent's field, that means that they have to commit cards from their hand onto the field. If you want to replace this card, you have to think the opposite way around. Instead of plussing to hand, you have to minus your opponent instead. Another card that you could replace Dragritter Halberd with would be the new Dragontree Grade 1 that comes out in set 9. So Dragontree Wretch Draco Ratical, what this card does is essentially once per turn, when your opponent's rearguard is retired during the main phase, you can Soul Blast 1, look at the top 5 and choose up to 1 grade 1 card from among them and call it to rearguard. This would mean that you'd have to run cards that retire during the main phase, like, you know, your on-place Counter +1, Soul Blast 1 to draw a card. Cards that have on-demand retire, which will mean that at least then the Halberd can kind of refund back its +2 cost. Doesn't really suit it that well, but at least it's something that you could consider. There's other ones like Dragritter Alwalith, which is when this unit is placed in rearguard, Counter +1, Soul Blast 1, choose one of your opponent's grade 2 or greater rearguards and retire. There's not really a really super duper good card to retire or to replace Halberd because it's just so good. This card makes Dragonic Overlord the end super duper good, and unfortunately, you know, it's just how it is. Going forward, how will this deck change in terms of which ride line to use? The answer is you can use which ride line you want. How does that kind of work, right? Derek, like if you're playing a deck focused on, you know, Dragonic Overlord the end, you're playing Ardor Hatchet Dragon, like why would you want to play the old Overlord in the ride deck? If you're playing Dragonic Overlord in the ride deck and you're going first, then sometimes you just might ride you know, Dragonic Overlord from your ride deck, you know, ride it on, swing a rear guard, and at least the next turn you have Dragonic Overlord like in the soul. The only thing that you'll be missing in that scenario is that you just don't have the Persona ride, right? That leads to the question, how much do you value Persona ride, and how much do you value an instant value of Dragonic Overlord? And you have to weigh the pros and cons of whether you want like an assured way to get Dragonic Overlord in the soul if you go first, versus you have to try to dig for it, drop it into the bin, and then retire the Ardor Hatchet Dragon to make sure it's in soul. There's a lot of moving pieces, but then at least then, if you're going second, for example, then you don't really need to ride from the ride deck, right? You can just ride from your hand a Dragonic Overlord at the end, and it's equivalent to discarding a card and riding from the ride deck anyways. You still have ways to find Dragonic Overlord, you know, from your deck, like Burning Horn Dragon. You're going through your Brachio Forces, you start to discard your Dragonic Overlord early on. Maybe let's just say you hard mulligan for your Dragonic Overlord, you ditch it during your ride phase for grade 1, grade 2, then at least you still have it in the bin, and you just ride Dragonic Overlord the end from your hand instead of riding it from your deck on your grade 3 turn. And from there, you'll be able to use Ardor Hatchet Dragon, put the Dragonic Overlord in soul, and then your effects are live. Actually, some of the Japanese lists are running the old Overlord engine because you're flexible enough to be able to do that. If you are running the Dragonic Overlord the end ride line, then the pros is that at least on turn 4, you have access to Persona Ride instead of having to wait to turn 5 for Persona Ride. It also means that if you see Dragonic Overlord in the early game, which means that you have 4 copies in the deck, Burning Horn Dragon will be able to find you it. Which means that if you ditch it, you find your Ardor Hatchet Dragon puts the Dragonic Overlord into soul, then, you know, at least you have it going second, and then you fulfill Dragonic Overlord the end's full effect. Now, going into a few of the games or the lines of play for this particular deck, what you want to do is you want to prioritize getting Burning Horn Dragon early, which means that in your mulligan you want to see Burning Horn Dragon. If you're playing the Dragonic Overlord ride line, then the key is that you need a way to find Dragonic Overlord the end. And the first way to find it is drawing it itself or Burning Horn Dragon. So if you don't have one or the other, then, you know, you want to always keep Dragonic Overlord the end. But if you don't find Dragonic Overlord the end, the next best card to keep is Burning Horn Dragon. And then you essentially mull everything else back. Halberd, you can search off your Bahr. So Bahr can search your any grade 1 in deck, and you can search Halberd. Halberd allows you to have it in hand for the discard fodder and then essentially call it back. Other cards you want to keep, you definitely want to keep Brachio Force. Brachio Force is a really good early game card, allows you to counter rush your opponent. If your opponent rushes you, you can rush back with this, and essentially it forces your opponent to guard from hand, especially if you are going first, because if your opponent is dropping grade 1s, they can't really intercept with grade 1s. So if Brachio Force just keeps swinging at the Vanguard, if your opponent takes it, then cool, they take 1 damage and they lose a unit on the board. It's pretty detrimental for them. Which means that Brachio Force is probably your second card to, I guess, keep in the mulligan alongside Dragonic Overlord the end and or Burning Horn, depending on which one you have access to. I mean, if you have access to Dragonic Overlord the end, then you don't really need Burning Horn Dragon that crucially. Then that means that you can start searching for, like, you know, your PGs, your Halberds. Yeah, pretty happy. Now, let's just say in the perfect world, you have, you know, 2 Brachio Force, Dragonic Overlord, the end, and, you know, you mulligan do that. The question is that what do you find on Bahr? The best thing to find on Bahr is your Elementaria. Bahr says that you can search for any grade 1 card, which means that you can search for orders. And what's an order? Elementaria Sanctitude. Elementaria Sanctitude, your grade 1 perfect guard, find it, add it to hand. Immediate way to bypass all your opponent's guard restricts. Chronojet has guard restrict, you know, Flagberg has guard restrict. Perfect out, perfect way to get around it. That's a really good priority, especially if you know what your matchups are. If you're versing Chronojet, you might want to attempt to get the Elementaria, because, you know, this deck is pretty tanky. It can go through a couple turns of Chronojet. It fights back on Chronojet's rush with Brachio Force, and, you know, you can just kind of keep that Sanctitude in hand. You drop your grade 1 PGs on, like, the next stage turns, and then if they ride down, you drop their Elementaria and, you know, call it a day. Elementaria sometimes is misused in the Chronojet matchup. A lot of people say that, you know, you use the Elementaria because it's a free PG on your opponent's stride. Make sure you don't do that, because if they are going to next stage and they ride down into Chronojet, that means Chronojet has a guard restrict which restricts all grade 1s or greater, which means you either one have to hard guard using your triggers, or you have to use your Elementaria. So be careful when you are using Elementaria against Chronojet. Make sure you keep it in hand, and when you need it, when you absolutely need it against Chronojet, then use it. And yeah, that's pretty much, I guess, the Mulligan targets. Now we're going to go through a bit of, I guess, sequencing in terms of how the turns play out. So obviously, you know, you have your ride deck, and the first discard target is always going to be Dragonic Overlord if you're playing a Dote variant build. So let's just say your ride line, you're running Dote as your grade 3, then the first discard target is always going to be Dragonic Overlord. Why is that? Because you have access to Ardor Hatchet Dragon. You need to make sure that your Dragonic Overlord is in the bin, and if you're searching it off Burning Horn, then you better hope you find your Dragonic Overlord, grab it to hand, and you discard the Dragonic Overlord for the Dote ride up. In the early game, it's pretty hard to rush with this deck, especially with grade 1s, but sometimes you can just drop a Madoka and attack. You don't really want to drop the Halberd, because the Halberd allows you to plus on your restands. So the only card that you can kind of commit on grade 1 is one Madoka, so you'll be hitting 2 lines. So one side is Madoka, and then obviously your middle column with Bahr. Going up to grade 2 though, then you have access to, you know, your Nahalims, your Ardor Hatchet Dragon, your Burning Horns, your Brachioforce. That's when you can start to push your Brachioforce. Brachioforce is the best on turn 2, because afterwards, you know, your opponent is gonna be on 13k. You can't solo attack with Brachioforce. You need boosters in the back, which means that you have to rely on Halberd. So then, once your opponent rises up to grade 3, then you want to intercept with your Brachioforce so that you free up those slots for the likes of Burning Horn and your Nahalims if you run more Nahalims. Otherwise, you want to play your Ardor Hatchet Dragon, because Ardor Hatchet Dragon, not only does it become a 5k shield in your hand, it's also when you intercept as well. So as long as it's put into the Guardian Circle, you have an Overlord, it's a 10k shield. So you're freely able to, you know, commit it to the front row, because on your opponent's first attack, you just intercept with it. It's a 10k shield. It's pretty good. But usually the front row would be, you know, your Burning Horn Dragons. If you're flooded with grade 3s in hand, like later on, you know, you already have your Dragonic Overlord in Soul, you're pretty happy, you know, you have your Dotes in hand for Persona Ride, and you have like some spare Dragonic Overlord, feel free to place it in the front row. It's a 13k, it's pretty good. Boosted by Madoka later on, it's a 10k booster, that's 23, Persona Ride 33. You're hitting pretty solid numbers, yeah? In the instance, let's just say, you know, you have like an 8k booster and it's your final turn, you really need to push, then you start to put your 5k triggers in front, and you can see why it's so important to have 5k crits instead of your 4k crits. This deck doesn't use Soul, and if you take out Nahalim, you're only using like the one Nahalim for Soul Blast, I guess. That's pretty much it. Like otherwise, you're not really using that much Soul anyways. So the Soul, as much as it's not being used, it's not being utilized for your effects, it's not bad, yeah? So then you place your crits in the front row in front of an 8k, it's 13, 18, or it was 13, 23 based on Persona Rides, and you know, you're having a pretty good time. If you end up swapping these for like Flarestrike Dragons, feel free to place the Flarestrike Dragons CB1, give your Vanguard plus 10. Yeah, you know, those cards are good, yeah, but I guess the only ones that you don't really want to commit is like your Perforate Dragons, which, you know, need to be discarded so that the effects applied. Sometimes Togachirashi you can place, if you're playing it in your deck, you can place it in the front row and try to bash early. Yeah, the good thing about this is that a lot of the cards are, I guess, kind of free. You don't really care too much about the added effects. Like Madoka is great as a 15k, but you know, if you're not pushing your opponent early and you're not getting, you know, the maximum out of your turns, then the 15k is worth the trade-off in the early game, because you know, the late game, you don't really need to care too much. You're about to kill your opponent anyways. They're struggling, so the 15k trade-off in the early game is pretty good, yeah? And yeah, that's pretty much it for, I guess, the sequencing. Maybe let's talk about some of the matchups, some of the big threats out there. The first one is Chronojet Dragon, and as I explained before, Brachioforce is your best friend against Chronojet Dragon, because you're essentially attacking into your opponent's units, you're retiring them, which means that if their hand is flooded with grade 1s, they can't fight back against a grade 2 Vanguard, which means that they have to force call like their upstreams or their Argandia, which means that you can start attacking into them. And if you play on place, like on demand retires, like your counter +1, soul +1 retires, then you could retire those as well. And if you're riding into the Dragonic Overlord, then you can start swinging at the Argandia, which is essentially a 15k shield worth of value. You know, you're living the good life. If your opponent is, you know, pushing you early, Brachioforce is a great way to, I guess, counter rush. And the best thing is that, like I said before, if you're going second, your opponent's committed 2 grade 1s, you're swinging at your opponent's Vanguard, they have to guard from hand, which means that cards that they would have in hand, right, they have to shift the grade 1s into the back row and play units in front, because obviously 8k can't attack a 10k base grade 2. That means that not only are you draining cards out of your opponent's hand, or you're putting them at high damage, but the fact that if they want to fight back, they have to commit cards onto the board. So which is why Brachioforce is just so good in this deck, so good in this meta against Chronojet. I think it's a must play, and if you have space for 4, I would. But, you know, I guess if you're playing the Dragonic Overlord, the end ride line, I guess you can take out one Dragonic Overlord, but I don't know. I think Dragonic Overlord is just too good. But the good thing is that this card doesn't actually need the original Overlord. It just says if your soul has a Dragonic Overlord. So I mean, if you find this, if you have another copy, I guess you can discard it and then, you know, call it a day. So you don't actually have to play multiple of the original Overlord, but it's more like if you're playing more of the original Overlord, then at least, you know, your effects with Burning Horn, it's likely to hit early, which means that you can start filtering out your deck of grade 3s, start ditching them, and then at least then your Ardor Hatchet Dragon is live. And you don't really want to ditch Dragonic Overlord the end either, because it's your Persona Ride targets, right? But at least then, you know, you can play Dragonic Overlords in 3 slots, and then this 1 slot can be, like, I guess, substituted for the 1 Brachioforce slot that you would be swapping for 4 Ardor Hatchet Dragon. So instead, you're substituting 1 Berserk Dragon and 3 Nahalims for Ardor Hatchet Dragon. Or alternatively, if you want to get rid of the 3rd Dragonic Overlord, then you can put the Chalice in there as well. So you can see, like, this Berserk Dragon isn't really doing too much. You can put like Chalice, and I guess that's like an extra slot for Ardor Hatchet Dragon. So yeah, just talking back at the Chronojet matchup, Brachioforce is your best friend. Try to fight back, fight early, and as I said before in the Minerva video, how to beat Chronojet. Well, actually, I said it in the Chronojet video. Like I said in the Chronojet video, how to beat Chronojet is beat them early. The faster you kill them, the more aggro that you put against them, you know, they just flop over because they're essentially on a time bomb. The longer the game goes, the stronger Chronojet gets, but if you explode on them early, then, you know, they can't really do too much. So that's how essentially you beat Chronojet. Eva, you put the pressure on early. You put the pressure on and make sure that you're attacking 3 lines early, because Eva is quite slow. They don't run combine rushes anymore, so their early game is actually pretty weak. But the moment that they get to grade 3, they play the new grade 3 order, top 5 core 1, and then, you know, they're spitting out their 4 attacks. They don't really have that much bind anymore, but they get really tanky. So as long as your Vanguard is hitting hard, your rear guards are hitting hard, you know, call it a day. Another matchup would be Youthberg. So Youthberg is Overlord Light, in my opinion. Overlord Light because your Overlord rear guards are actually pretty big. Like, you're talking about this. This is a 20k by itself, 30k on Persona Ride plus a Halbei. Halbei is a 13k booster, that's 43. 43 without any triggers on a Persona Ride turn. 33 on a non-Persona Ride turn. It's actually pretty beefy, much bigger than Youthberg numbers. So it's the same concept, just smash them in the face, smash them early. The quicker you beat them, you know, you're in a pretty good time. And the good thing about Overlord is that the hand in Overlord is not like Youthberg. Youthberg, sometimes you just draw all your revolve forms and you're just stuck there and you can't really find a way to filter your hand for, like, you know, good pieces. You have to kind of trigger into your triggers so that you have defensive value. Overlord doesn't care. Overlord can discard 2 of whatever cards they want. You find a Halbei, it's a +2, you know. The card quality in Overlord is actually much better than Youthberg, so this deck shouldn't have any issues against Youthberg. You just play Youthberg, but better, bigger rear guards, better hand quality, it's just everything's there. Other notable matchups would be like Flagberg. Flagberg retires stuff, so if you're playing against Flagberg, you want to keep front row rear guards and try to intercept with them. Obviously your Halberds will get retired, unfortunately. It's like retired 2. Feels pretty bad, but I mean, you know, that's the price you pay. And sometimes against Flagberg, the good thing is that you can keep your Ardor Hatchet Dragon in the front, start intercepting for like 10k shield. You're in a pretty good spot. And yeah, that's pretty much it for the matchups and the video. Essentially, that's pretty much the build and how things will change once you get access to the new promo. Halberd is just busted, and unfortunately, it's pretty much an irreplaceable card at the moment, unless, you know, something better comes out. But yeah, this is pretty much the Dragonic Overlord Comprehensive Guide. I hope you guys enjoyed that. If you guys like this video, pop a like, comment down below what you guys think about Overlord in the current metagame at the moment. I feel that Overlord is a little bit slow, but the longer the game goes, the stronger this deck becomes, and the power spike on it actually comes sooner than some of the other decks in the metagame at the moment. If you guys haven't subscribed, make sure you press the subscribe button, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.